Okay, good morning. We are on page 81 in the Hemshech Tzadik Daled 5694, and we're discussing around 3/4 of the way down. We're discussing the different levels of rotzen, desire, or maybe better put, the process, how from a nefesh, etzem nefesh, talking about the human being. And of course, this is going to be applied to how things are above Lamaila before the Tzimtzum, that from the etzem nefesh, what he calls a nefesh, I'm just using the language, exact language. The nefesh is in a state of hafshata and shlila, completely removed and negating any form of even stimulation. It is just an etzem nefesh. So now it's moving to haskama, something, he said, inspired this consideration to have a relationship. So what's happening in the level of haskama? It's moving from the nefesh that doesn't have any relationship to consideration of the possibility. The exact words are, haskama is with a nefesh, yetzes, it causes hanefesh yetzas meklal hafshata v'shlila, u'bo l'klal nesinis smokim la'toyev ha'amshach l'dover zulasa. It's come to a state of giving room, the possibility, considering the possibility, or agreeing to consider the possibility, however you exactly translate it, for a connection to another. So he says clearly, so the haskama relates to the maimud matzav hanefesh, which means this state of consideration is misyachis yeser. It relates more. It doesn't say relates only, but it relates more to the state of the soul than from the way it relates to the thing that it is desiring. So consideration is really much more reflective of the soul's shift to a consideration of a relationship. So what's the chiddush that came? He says the chiddush is that the nefesh has shifted, but nothing else has happened. Nothing has concretized. And here he says, not only in this heskim, there's not even a mehusa mitzias, which is already the level of a mitzias of rotzen, and the mehusa of that mitzias is that it's drawn hatoya v'amshocha. Klal el degam mitzias mehusay einay dadayin. There's not even a mitzias of a mehus. In other words, even the emergence from the mehus of the mehus has not really been developed. And as I explained yesterday, and as I mentioned before the class here now, so how does he say in the page before that it became Masha Nisava Mitzias Mehusay Bolvad, where he minimized, said only Mitzias Mehusay? So you have to say, it's very straight, it's very, very obvious, the answer. Because the Heskim is the beginning of a process of that will become a Mitzias HaMehus. It will be concretized in the Hachlota, in the determination that follows the deliberation of the Shakavitarya. But at this stage, when you dissect it into steps, which she did not do in the bottom of page 81, just like in the previous Maimer, Heskim and Hechlet were all like in one synonymous sentence and phrase, that this was a determination. Now he's breaking it into three levels: consideration, deliberation, and determination. So he's saying it's not even, not only is it not Metzias, Mehusa Metzias, even you don't even have Metzias HaMehus. Why? As he said earlier in the page, because after the consideration, there's still going to be a process of deliberation. And he said earlier that deliberation may actually be hepech haheskim. It could end up contradicting and negating and rejecting this consideration. In other words, the nefesh has agreed to consider, and then it rejects it. Like he said much lines before, he said that it can contradict and negate the general agreeable consideration of the relationship. Okay. And I explained already the difference between how it is by a human being and by God, but we'll discuss more of this later, because obviously by God, if he's considering, The goal is that it should become a reality. But still, on the consideration level, it's much more the nefesh's shift. That's the key thing to remember. That Heskim is the nefesh's shift. That's what makes it still a Ratzon Kloli, the beginning of the Ratzon. Like he said, Ascholos HaRatzon Kloli. So Ratzon Kloli consists of 3 levels. Consideration, Heskim, deliberation, Shakavitaria, and determination, Achlota. The beginning of the process, and all of that is called the Metzias HaMahus. The beginning of it begins with Heskim, it moves to Shakavitaria, and then to determination. All 3 will end up being the Ratzon Kloli. But at this stage, we only have the consideration. The main thing is the shift of the spirit of the soul's state of being to a consideration for a relationship. Okay, that sums up that. Now he moves and starts talking about the Shakavitaria. What exactly is going on? He says, V'hagam, and though this Shakavitaria is not happening on lower levels, it's all happening in the realm of Ratzon. Later he'll say Partsuf of Ratzon. It's all happening in the realm of Ratzon. And he does use the word now, Metzias Mahusei, which, as I said, I believe that we'll understand what that means when we go to this page and the next. So just hold on with that. I'm not going to right now explain it. He's saying okay, so he says like this. The difference between Shakavitaria and Seichel is that it's connected to reason, rational reason. A rational reason, and therefore that reason compels an argument, taina hechlich sichli, nasa taina shu hechlich sichli. It makes an argument, that compelling logical argument. And we talk about Tenuas Chiv, Tenuas Shlila, that's not Negei right now in the summary. But Metzias Mohusei Shel HaRatzon, who? The Metzias Mohus of the Ratzon, meaning as the Ratzon begins to emerge from Mohus of Mohus, of the Nefesh, into some state of being, which, as I just said, begins with a Heskim, but that is not yet a Metzias HaMohus till it moves through Shakavitaria and Hechlet, deliberation and determination. He says that just like it has no reason, it also does not have any compelling argument. There's no taina achrachah. There's no argument that you could argue one way because this is not based on a logical process. What is it based on? He doesn't really say explicitly. That's why I explained that Ratzon could be a Shakavitari. That's not based on logic. It's based on different factors, whether you are going to determine to do so or not. Like say whether it's the desire for a home. You could consider it and then, you know what, and say, right now I'm not making the decision yet. Whatever the reason may be. It may not be a logical. He's clearly saying it's not in the realm of logic. Okay. Because that's its Metzias HaMohus is what? Mashu Reitze. The Nefesh wants something. It doesn't have to be defined by a reason. I'm sorry, the Metzias HaMohus makes sense. Fine. But now he says, V'zeh atzmei bo b'mochus mitziyusei shu atoyev amshach le'esei hadavar. So what happens now? He's explaining the next step. What's the next step? After you have the Metzias HaMohus, which comes after the Shakavitaria, and the determination, as we said, determination is still not being drawn to it. So you don't have a Metzias of Ratzon. All you have is a Metzias of the Mohus. The Mohus has considered, has deliberated, and has determined this is worthy of being desired, as he said. Roy lirzes, but not lirzes bepeil. What's lirzes bepeil? Now comes the state of Ratzon sinner that's actually being drawn. And that, as we've been learning in the last mimer all along, is referring to Mohus HaMetzias. So now you're talking about a real Metzias of Ratzon. There's a real desire, and the desire is being drawn. That's its Mohus, its personality of this stage of Ratzon, which we're calling now Ratzon Prati, or earlier was called Ratzon Golei, the different names for it. This is now not just a machshava. It's no longer a machshava, not a machshava kara, not a machshava in general. It's not just a thought. It's an active desire that's pursuing. in a state of hatoyev amshocha. He calls this Mehusa Metzias, and now he's going to explain.
Le'achar shakla v'tarya, right?
Again, there's a Ratzon
Le'achar
Kloli.
shakla v'tarya.
I'm gonna answer it in a full sentence and try to write it down or remember this. It's not mechanical, it's logical. Even though it's not logical with Tam V'das, but it's Ratzon Kloli is the first step of desire. It's made up of 3 steps. 1 is a heskim, which is a consideration. 2 is a shtak v'tarya, a deliberation. 3 is a hachlota, a determination. Stop. Then comes stage 2 in Ratzon. Ratzon aproti. Ratzon aproti is now hatoyev amshocha, which means it's being drawn and pursuing toward the object of desire. It's an active pursuit. It's not just a determination that can be there and years, nothing should happen. So obviously, the Ratzon that is pursuing follows the Ratzon Kloli, which consisted of consideration, deliberation, and determination. So now comes stage 2, which is the active pursuit. Yes, follows the determination, which follows the deliberation, which follows the consideration. Okay. So basically, now he explains what we learned yesterday. I'm summing it up, that from Mohus Metzias HaMohus, from that comes Mohus HaMetzias. And I gave the example from other Maimorim that the Dibur, speech within thought, from that is conceived thought within speech, if you recall. So that basically, once the nefesh is considering and then deliberating and then determining, now you have a metzias of a muhus. The muhus has now manifested in a Ratzon Kloli, all 3 steps. Now comes the next step. From that metzias a muhus will become the muhus a metzias, the driving force of the Ratzon that pursues the object, not just determines that it's worthy of being desired, an absolute determination, as opposed to the Heskim, which is not absolute, it's just a consideration. Now it's actively, the Ratzon is in an active mode of sinner, a channel pursuing the object. In the example, let's go back to the example. You want to have a home. First comes a Heskim, considering. Then comes a deliberation. Then comes a determination, yes, I want a home. And that's that, it stops. It can last now years, that can reside within you, that determination. Then comes the moment, and it could be many years, it could be immediately, where you go and say, I'm going to now actually pursue that determination. I'm going to take that determination, I'm going to turn it into an active pursuit to be drawn toward the object. And that consists of steps. You start planning, you start thinking, you start seeing who's going to build it, how you're going to build it, what are the details. Remember, he said before, with determination, you're not even thinking of what it's made of, what's the home going to be built like, what type of rooms are going to be in there. All this was said and explained in the previous Maimer, the difference between determination, the Ratzon, the first step in Ratzon, and the second step. Now we're including a 3rd step, which we'll get to, the Ratzon HaKodem. But let's not talk about that for now. So we've already discussed in the previous Maimer the difference between a Ratzon that's a determination, but doesn't have any details. There's no tzir mefuret, as he put it. If you want to look back at it, and that's why I suggest look in the Maimer, all this has been explained. I'm assuming that we covered that. But if you need to go over it again, no problem. Just go back to page 56. I believe that's where it is. Yeah. Page 56, where he explains this in detail. The difference between determination and the active pursuit. Basically, the difference between Ratzon that's still machshava and not a determination, and the state where a determination, but not yet an active Ratzon that's called sinner. Back on page 56. Truth is, it goes earlier as well, but in 56, he gives the example with a house. So it's very clear. In the first state of desire, it's a Ratzon Kloli. You're not thinking about how many rooms in the home. You're not thinking about what the furniture in the home. You're not thinking about what the home is made of. Wood, stones. as he said there, offer, earth. But now from the Metzias HaMahus has moved now to Mahus HaMetzias, which is where you are actively pursuing this object. She says, so from Metzias Mahusim Ashur Reitze, Ze Atzmai, this itself, Ba B'Mahus, Metzius Sha'atoyev Amshoche La'ese Adover Shur Reitze. Ukanal, this we learned yesterday, I'm just reviewing it again, that we learned earlier, and I point that out, page 26, in a very different subject matter, that everything has a Mahus HaMetzias and Metzias. To explain it again, in case you didn't pick it up, you can always go back. I explained Mahus HaMetzias very detailed on Sunday, in the Sunday class from Tafshin Aleph and Tafresh Ayin Beis. You could also look up those Maimorim if you like. There it's in detail. So basically, to put it in simple English again, Mahus HaMetzias. I'm going to speak about it from the bottom up, which is the easier way for us to understand it. We human beings, we relate initially to everything we see or hear, everything we experience, every phenomenon, every person, every object, every interaction. We always begin with Metzias. The Metzias, the existence of something. What does it mean, existence? Some tangible manifestation. You see a table, it's a table, a chair. We do not right away relate to the Mahus of something unless we already thought about it or we were told. Because the Mahus is already asking a question, Mahu. The Frierdiker Rebbe brings in those Maimorim that I just cited in Tiku Tafshin Aleph and Pesach Maimer of Tafresh Ayin Beis. She says, what is Mahu? Mahu is, okay, let's say the first time ever you've seen a table. Great. And someone shows it to you, and you say, Mahu, what is this? So you'll be explained, this table is made in order to sit around the table to learn Torah. It's a table that's made in order to have a meal. And you explain the details, what the Mahus of this table is. That's all Mahus. That's Mahus, and that's Metzias. Another example, you see somebody crying. Tears come out of their eyes. The Metzias of tears is very clear. It's wet, it's salty, it's tangible. You see it. Someone will say to you, what are tears? So you'll say tears is an expression of a person's emotions. Either emotions of happiness, tears of joy, or tears of sadness. Initially, you just see tears. It looks like water. Maybe it's water coming out of a faucet, coming out of your eyes. But everybody understands there's a mahus of the Metzias of the tears. What's the mahu of the tears? What is it? An emotional expression. For some reason, the way we were created is that when you're very sad or you're very happy, it will express itself. Zolgu d'moy, ein of d'moyes. The eyes will drip with tears. Rabbi Akiva, when he learned Seder Satera, the secrets of Torah, his eyes dripped with tears. He was crying from sheer awesomeness and pleasure from the experience. May not be pleasure, maybe being in awe. Sometimes you cry out of great joy, out of great being overwhelmed by something. You could also cry. My point is the Mulchus and the Metzias are very different. Now, once you know both, you understand the Mulchus of the Metzias of tears is the emotions involved. The Metzias is the expression of the tears. If you look at a page in a book, in a sefer, the letters of the page is the Metzias. The Mahus is Mahu. What's the message that the letters and words and phrases, sentences and paragraphs are conveying? That's Metzias and Mahus. Where it gets a little more intricate is that each one has the other. There's the Mahus of the Metzias and there's the Metzias of the Mahus. So you end up having 4 levels. Mahus of the Mahus, Metzias of the Mahus, Mahus of the Metzias, and Metzias of the Metzias. And I explained that again at length Sunday. Briefly, when you break it down, let's say an example with the tears, you could say the Mahus of the tears, yes, may be emotions, but what's the Mahus of the Metzias of the tears could be something, it's not emotions yet. It could be what are the DNA, the building blocks, what consists of a tear, tear ducts, how the emotion translates into tears. So the Mahus of the Metzius focuses mainly on understanding what is the identity of the object. The Metzius of Mahus is reflecting more what is the expression of the essence of what is where the whole process begins. Now we travel always from the top, bottom up. We start from Metzius, we move to Mahus. Metzius to Mahus Metzius. Then we move to Metzius of Mahus, and then Mahus of Mahus. Mahus of Mahus is obviously the most elusive and the most difficult, and sometimes is not accessible altogether. The example, when using the artist, I said, you look at a piece of art, that's a Metzius. You study the art and you learn its Mahus. What's the message that the art is? That's Mahus of the Metzius. You don't yet know the Mahus of the person, the artist that created it. Then you meet the artist and you see the artist expresses and explains why he created the art, what is his intentions. Now you're getting into Metzius of the Mahus of the artist. And then Mahus of the artist, either you'll access or you won't access. But the point is, it's a process that goes step by step by step. You move from the most tangible to understanding its identity. Then you move to the next level where you want to understand the tangible of the tangible, the expression of the Mahus of Mahus, which is beyond really expression. In Machshava Dibur, it works very well. There's the thought within the thought, there's the speech within the thought, there's the thought within the speech, and there's the speech within the speech. The same thing with the Shama of a Guf, the soul and body, and so on, as discussed on Sunday. So relevant to Ratzon, basically, as I would understand it, it's not explicit, because there's different ways to explain it. The nefesh, before even a stimulation or inspiration to desire, to even consider a relationship, is most likely the Mahus of Mahus. There's no Ratzon yet. There's not even the consideration of a Ratzon. Then comes Ratzon Klali, which consists of 3 steps: consideration, deliberation, and determination. There you have the Metzius of the Mahus. You're finding out what the Mahus of the Nefesh is now considering, and then deliberating upon, and then determining to have a relationship. So it's the emergence, it's all, the consideration part focuses primarily, as he said, on the Nefesh's shift. It's considering. The determination, as we'll learn shortly, is already determining that, yes, I want this relationship. And then will come, that's all in the level of Mahus, Metzius HaMahus. Once it moves now to pursuing the Ratzon Prati, the next level of active pursuit, the real Ratzon, what we call Ratzon Mamish, that there's an actual desire that's pursuing Hatoyev Amshacha, that's called the Mahus of the Metzius of the Ratzon. What is the Metzius of the Ratzon? He again doesn't say it explicitly, but Pashtas, that's the actual desire. You actively want some object. What is the personality of that? The Mahus of that desire, the pursuit of it, that you're actively pursuing it. So you could say that the Ratzon, the Metzius of the Ratzon, is probably, may not be Ratzon HaKodem even. It may actually be the Ratzon Golei that comes after you've pursued it, after you've allocated resources, Hashara B'Keach, and now there's an active Ratzon ready to build the home or whatever the desire is. So that's how I explained it, and therefore he's saying, from the Metzius of the Mahus, which is the 3 levels, which consists of the first level of Ratzon HaKlali, which is made up of 3 steps, comes Mahus HaMetzius, which is being drawn in the pursuing of it. That's the breakdown here. And it's based, obviously, on everything we learned in the previous Maimer of the 2 stages in desire. We didn't get to Ratzon HaKodem yet. So just bear that in mind. We will get to it. So he says like this, that everything has a Mahus HaMetzius, Hinekenu gam b'Ratzon. I'm reading from the line that starts boy on page 81. So he says, Hinekenu gam b'Ratzon. The same as with desire. The Metzius Mahusei ba Mahus Metziusei, which is what I just explained. From the Metzius of the Mahus, which is the first Ratzon Klali, that the Mahus of the Nefesh has now manifested in a general desire, which is made up of 3 steps. He says, from that will now come the Mahus of the Metzius. So Im Kain, this is the process. So what do we, Im Kain, if that's the case, Hashaka v'tari hu beparts of harotzen gufa. The shaka v'tari we've been speaking about is within the parts of rotzen, in the structure or the composite of rotzen. The word partsuf means basically there's an ukuda sfira partsuf. Partsuf is used by the Arizal as a concept of a combination of spheres. For example, the partsuf of moichin is chochma and bina. Chochma bina das sometimes. Chochma and bina is a partsuf. Chochma alone is a sfira. Bina is a sfira. Zo is a partsuf. Zoyer Ampin is made up of chesed, gvura, teferes, netzach, chayd, yesed. So a partsuf is a composite of several dimensions. That's why you say partsuf on a face. You say the sein partsuf, his face. Why is it a face? Because a face is not made up only of eyes or ears or a nose and a mouth and cheeks and so on. A face is a combination of several items that creates a structure. So the expression in Kabbalah is nekuda, is a dot. Sphira is a full-bodied sphere, like chesed, gvura, chochma, bina. And partsuf is a combination of spheres. So that's the general way we understand it. So he's saying, rotzen also is a partsuf.
What is the dot?
What?
What is the nekuda?
The beginning of the formation of anything begins always with a dot. Like Yud Ke Vav Ke, Yud, Hey, Vav Ke. Anyway, it's not relevant to this discussion, so let's not go there right now. At the beginning, everything begins with a dot. The dot manifests in a full-bodied sphira, Chochma, Bina. Yes, sometimes Chochma is considered a dot compared to Bina, but Chochma is also a sphira. Compared to higher, that's not even Chochma is a sphira, Bina is a sphira. So now, there's another partsuf called partsuf harotzen. Where's the Shaka V'Tarya that we're discussing here? Not the Shaka V'Tarya in Chabad. That is a lower level. That's a deliberation that we learned back on page. What page was it? Page 53, 54. That would be a deliberation that's usual. Deliberation is in Seichel. The partsuf of Seichel would be called, the partsuf of Moichin. This Shaka V'Tarya is the partsuf harotzen, because it's all happening on the rotzen domain. We have not moved to any intelligent structure yet. It's all the desire determining. The Shaka V'Tarya is taking the consideration and deliberating on it to determine that, yes, this is what we are, that the nefesh absolutely desires. So therefore, the Shaka V'Tarya is a parts of harotzen gufa.
Rotzen akloli. Rotzen akloli. Right?
It says parts of harotzen gufa.
But you explained the whole entire time rotzen akloli, because rotzen aproti is already much lower.
Correct. That's correct. He said that earlier, yeah. If you look on the top, he says on line 6 or 7, he says, Achre heskem ba achlota, ubeina heskem ba achlota yeshna Shaka V'Tarya. It's very clear. If you look on line 6, 5, after the consideration comes the determination, which is the end of the rotzen klali, and the beginning of the rotzen proti and rotzen hakodum. Ubeina heskem ba'achlota yeshna Shaka V'Tarya sheberotzen. So there clearly he says between the heskem and achlota is the deliberation. Then he says the word chemer tchilas rotzen klali. I'm sorry, chemer rotzen proti. You say rotzen kodem. We're soon going to get to that. How that turns into the next stage. Here he's clearly saying that from the Metzias HaMahusa has become Mahusa Metzias. Let's see how he's now going to explain the Shaka V'Tarya. You have to halt cup and we have to read the whole picture here. V'nizbar le'il, and as we explained earlier, the Barotzen, haloi kol hadarga sheboy ben ikrim and ben protim v'anofim kulam hem rotzen. When you talk about desire, if you remember, let me refer you where he said this. Top of page 56. Actually, bottom of 55 and top of 56. which, by the way, there he called it a Ratzon Klali. He already used the word Klali there. So on top of 56, he said that even though a Ratzon, you need to have all the details, have to all be fulfilled to be a Ratzon. I'm sorry, I should say the other way around. Even though there are details, and every detail has its particular role, there's the primary elements, there's the specifics. Nevertheless, altogether, a Ratzon, for it to be complete, is an equalizer of general and specific. So if you want a home, yes, there are primary elements in the home, the most important rooms in the home. And then there's secondary rooms, the most important beams or pillars. And there's secondary ones. So if you're talking the details, there's differences. But as far as a Ratzon Shalom goes, a complete Ratzon, I want my home complete. If one detail is missing, the whole Ratzon is compromised. That's what we learned back then. So he's saying, so that was on top of page 50. Canal, the Bechol Dover, yes, I'm sorry. With his brother, but Ratzon, like Kol Adargish Shehein Sheboy. Both the primary ones, Ikrim, Bein Ikrim, Be Protim Vanofim, and both the details and the branches, not the main artery, but the branches, Kulam Hem Ratzon. They're all equalized, they're all desire. Also the details. In Cain, that's the case. Ma yochel lahesif hashakavetari ala heskem hakloli hakodem. Since the Ratzon is equal in all areas, so what could the shakavetari, the deliberation, add on the general consideration that you've had? Remember, the first state is a consideration, a general heskem kloli hakodem that preceded it, the shakavetari. What could it add or what could it change? Now, we need to understand this question exactly. What is he trying to say? So here's some thoughts, because when you read it, like what's the point here? You said there's a heskem klali, a consideration, but it's only a consideration. He said clearly the shakavetari could actually contradict and negate this consideration. He said that clearly up on the top of the page. Now he's saying the shakavetari is all happening in Ratzon. He began with a hagam. The whole thing started with hagam. So it seems to me what he's saying is like this, that since every detail of Ratzon is all part of the whole picture, even the heskem, which means once the haskama moves into a determination and then moves into a pursuit, so what is the shakavetari adding? That's what it seems like he's asking. But what's not clear is, we said clearly it's only a consideration. That's why you need a shakavetari, which is a deliberation. So I'm not positive what he's adding right now, and I would rather read on till we understand it. I read it a bunch of times. Not clear to me what he's saying, to be honest. Now, what he says next is, Umakol Mokim, and nevertheless, so I'm going to go back to this. I'm saying clearly, I'm not sure what the gist here is. I know the general picture of what the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to say, but I'm not sure how he's structuring it. Umakol Mokim, he says, and nevertheless, Hinil Acher Kol Zeh, after all of this, after all, halo yochelius, isn't it possible that the deliberation will not be consistent with whatever the consideration was? In other words, you're considering, let's say, having a home. The shakavetari deliberation will not agree. It'll give different angles on this to the point that it could disagree with that initial hesken. The heskem was a consideration or agreeability or agreement that this thing is worthy of being desired. The shakavetari could contradict that. So that just, to me, that just makes it more complex, more confusing here. You just said, what does the Shakavitaria add or change in the consideration, in the Heskem Kloli? And now he's saying that Makol Mokim, after all, it actually doesn't, it actually could change the Ratzon, the Heskem Kloli. So it's clearly there's something going on here, which is not, I would say, not obvious yet until we read further. So if you're confused, so am I. So let's continue reading, and we're going to go back to this. We're not going to skip this. Just because it's not clear, I just say, let's finish the whole subject that he's saying, and then we can go back and see where's he going with this. Bottom line is, it seems like there's a discussion here now. Does the deliberation affect the consideration or not? On one hand, he's saying, since everything desire is all part of desire, even though, as I said, he didn't desire it yet, he's only considering desiring it. So what's on one hand, he's saying, what does the deliberation add or change? And nevertheless, the deliberation could be not consistent with the consideration. So I have my theory, what he wants to say, but I'd rather not impose it without learning first further lines, okay? So now he says like this. So we have to go back to these few lines to understand what is the point that he's trying to say here. So now he continues and says the following words. Ach im zeh, however, together with simultaneously, hinezehu muhusei dashaka v'tari deratzen. This is the personality of the deliberation of desire, the loizu bulvad, that not only the eines seised es a heskem, that it does not contradict the consideration, ela af gam eina machlishe, it also doesn't weaken it. So basically he's saying that the role of the deliberation here is not to come to change the consideration. In Seichel, it does come to do that. We're going to learn that in a moment. Basically, he's explaining that Shaka V'Tari, we would think that you consider, then you weigh back and forth in the Shaka V'Tari deliberate, and the deliberation could actually come to a conclusion, not like the consideration. He's saying, no, that's not its role. Its role is not to determine whether the consideration is worthy or not. What is its role? Its role is to support that consideration. So this is where he's now clarifying how I would understand it. What we learned till now was just making the statements of Shaka V'Tari. Now he's explaining what its true role is. But again, let's be patient.
So it's not really a Shaka V'Tari.
Let's see what he's going to say. Yeah, because usually Shaka V'Tari means you present a theory, a considered theory, and then you debate it. That's what Shaka V'Tari means. But let's see what he's going to say. He says, the bezeh v'hainu, which means the bezeh choluk, hashaka v'tari derotzen, hashaka v'tari deseichel. With this is distinguished the liberation of rotzen, of desire, in comparison to the liberation of seichel, of intelligent deliberation. The hashaka v'tari deseichel, when you're deliberating upon something with intelligence of mind, it's possible someone suggests an idea. You see this in the Gemara. After you read the Mishnah, starts the Gemara says, what's the reason? What's the reason behind the Tana's statement? Comes an Ameira or another Tana and gives a theory. Comes another, his colleague, and says, no, that theory is not right. What is this, a Shaka V'Tari and Seichel? You begin with a scholar, with an idea, and it's possible that it completely can contradict it. That's what the Shaka V'Tari is. A Shaka V'Tari has the full potential that it should completely contradict what that the theory that was posited, that was presented. Shu shekel u'mafalis ba. The scholar that he's weighing now, shekel u'mafalis. Mafalis is another word for weighing. Shekel means like you're considering, you're weighing. The word from the word mishkol. So it's like weighing an idea. It's basically evaluating an idea. So shekel u'mafal, that the shakav v'tari in seichel is able to contradict what the initial idea that he's considering, weighing, evaluating, exploring, probing. All these are proper words. What follows ba, the idea that he's evaluating, it can contradict it, or at least it can weaken it. So someone can present a position and say, why do objects fall? We see when you throw an apple up in the air or a stone, it falls to the ground. So someone say, why? Someone say, you know what? Because the ground has a koyach, everything falls back to its source. Or someone will say the theory called gravity. These are theories. A theory is subject to deliberation. You could have thinkers and scientists deliberate, and someone will say, no, here I have a different theory, or this theory is not a good theory. It's wrong. Or you say it's a possible theory, but you weaken it through different arguments. So in other words, it's like a weak theory. It's either a wrong theory or a weak theory. This is the process of shakal v'tarya and deliberation and intelligence. I mean, when someone comes with an idea and then says, let me hear your opinion on it, and they don't want to hear opinions, then that's what you say to them. One second, you're asking our opinion, you just want us to agree with you. That's not shakal v'tarya. Shakal v'tarya is defined exactly what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu. He showed Moshe Rabbeinu when he was on Har Sinai. He took a posuk in the Torah and gave Moshe Rabbeinu memtes ponim toher, 49 arguments that this thing is pure. Then he gave memtes ponim tome, 49 arguments that it's not pure. So Moshe says to Hashem, so which one is it? So Hashem says the posuk in Mishpatim, achrei rabim lahatis. It's a klal, a posuk, that you will follow the consensus, that you down on earth will come together, a Bezdin, a Sanhedrin, a Beis Medrash, whatever it is, and you will weigh all the arguments. Is it pure, toher? Is it tomei? This is the essential basis of shakal v'tarya. The Eibishter could have said to Moshe, I'm giving you the laws, and that's it. There's no discussion. This is what you do, this is what you don't do. But he didn't make it that way. He gave a whole part of, there's our halacha l'Moshe Sinai, there are things that are givens that you cannot debate. But there's a whole process. That's every morning we say, Yud Gimel Midrash Atayr Nidreshes Behem. What is that? 13 methodologies how you do the shakal v'tarya of Torah. Kal v'chemer, Gzeir Shaveh, etc., etc. Klal, Prat. What are these guidelines, these methods? That's how we deliberate. Someone will say, are you allowed to use a Shabbos elevator? Are you allowed to listen to the Megillah on the radio? These are modern questions. Are you allowed to do a heart transplant? So what do Lemdei Torah do, Poskim do? They sit down, they begin to analyze it. And they look at precedents and they look at theories. For example, with the Keil Megillah, does it matter that you hear the voice of the person reading it, or you just have to hear the message? Like Limud HaTorah, for example, if you learn a siyum, you hear a siyum, or you hear Torah on the radio or on internet, that's called Limud HaTorah, because Limud HaTorah does not require the Keil Adam. You don't need a human being's voice, actual voice. It doesn't matter if it's digital, because the ikar is to learn. But there are things that need an actual Keil Adam. All this is a shakal v'tarya. What does it mean? Back and forth. Someone can come up with a whole theory, and then they present it, and his colleague will say, 1 second, the theory is not necessarily correct. This is an exception. It's not exactly the same case. I mean, you know how many arguments they have over heart transplants? Because what the doctors, modern doctors, call death is not necessarily what Torah calls death. With the brain dead and so on. Point being is that there is a whole shakavatari. I'm just giving you examples. In seichel, it's all about logical arguments that can absolutely, the whole point of it is that it can contradict. If not, it's not a shakavatari. Then it's just a predetermined decision. And that's not the way the Torah works. So, and not only Torah, seichel in general. This is not just, I'm just giving examples from Torah. That's shakavatari in seichel. So what the bottom line is that it could contradict the theory and or at least can weaken it. It doesn't, by the way, mean it has to do that, but it can do that. If not, it's not a shakavatari. Because you could also have, like you see in the Gemara, someone presents a counter argument, slugs up and contradicts what the first one said, and then another one comes and affirms it and brings another theory that reaffirms what the initial theory was. So it doesn't mean it has to contradict, but it could contradict and it could weaken. But the liberation that's in the realm of desire, rotzen, like you said before, not only that it doesn't contradict, it also doesn't weaken, which means it doesn't at all shift the initial theory, the initial, in this case, not theory, the initial consideration of the rotzen. So now we have to understand what exactly then is the role of the shakavatari. What's its purpose then? Why is there a shakavatari? If it's just going to affirm the consideration, what exactly is its role? I'm just pointing that out. So he says the following now. Kiklolos hamtsoos mitzius muhuse shalaheskim. Because the general emergence of the mitzius of the muhus in the desire, like I explained before, it's the beginning of the process that will lead to a mitzius muhus. That's the only way you can explain it, because he said earlier that you don't yet have it shaped and formed. So he say the general meaning, you've moved away from the nefesh has shifted to a consideration. So this general hamtzos, mitzius muhus shalaheskim, he's repeating what he said before. In other words, when it comes to a theory in seichel, where does the initial theory come from? It doesn't have any absolute value. It's not like God told you an idea and then you know it's absolutely true, and now you just have to confirm it. A theory is a human theory. It's coming from the seichel. Someone comes up with a theory to explain something, and then you can contradict it. He's saying the role of the heskim was not just some theory that flew out of nowhere. Its general presence is what? Is only one thing: to cause the nefesh to go down a level. And now he says the word oinetiyah, to incline, or causes an inclination within the nefesh, l'schaber el adover zulosa mashak, to connect, to have a relationship with another, to connect to another. Remember, he said clearly, though the heskim does not have any mitzias, because it's still only one thing, it's the soul considering the possibility of a relationship. And he said before, Yitzia and Heirada, he used those words, or inclination he's using now, to connect with another entity. Till now, like he says, he's comparing. Prior to the Heskim, prior to this stage of consideration, Hoya Nefesh Musla, next page, 82, Hoya Mesel Musla Mazeh. The Nefesh was completely negated that possibility, not an active negation. Musla means it was in a state that was not even in that place. There was no consideration altogether. Umasha heskim, bob tziyur, ashadover kazer roy linches by, and what this agreement or this consideration that comes in a shape that this thing is worthy of being desired, hu ein ela rak ein gram bedover. Or goram bedover, gram. It's nothing but only like a cause. Sheyeh mitzias muhus shel heskem. That there should be a mitzias of the muhus of the heskem. So in other words, it's not quite substantial. It's only like a cause, but it's significant enough because it's not the nefesh in its pure state. And therefore, it's understood the early statement that he made, this was the initial point of departure, that this consideration, la'atzmei, on its own, is not ein dover adayin. Nothing exists yet. It's essentially, it's the consideration of the soul, the possibility of a relationship. Now, I know he uses the word mitzias muhus here, shalaheskim, as he used it at the bottom of page 80. But on page 81, he made it very clear that it's not yet a mitzias. So you have to say what he says, gram, a gram bedover, meaning a cause. It means it's causing a mitzias to begin to emerge. That's how I would explain it. Because he's saying it clearly, it's not a dover yet either.
This is something new that he didn't say before, the gram.
Right, it is new. But he's explaining, this is why I said we should learn the whole piece, because every few lines he adds another drei. The end of the day, it's one story, obviously. But that's why I suggested let's read the whole thing, and then we can go back and understand what's going on here. We still need to understand what's the role of the Shakavatari exactly. But still, what he's said now is that the Heskim is essentially a nafshis dike tenua. It's a movement of the soul towards something. The soul is now moving toward a mitzias of a muhus. Not just a muhus, it's a mitzias of muhus. Also, it's interesting, he says mitzias muhus shala heskim. That the mitzias of the muhus of the heskim, which would suggest that the heskim itself also has a muhus of muhus and a mitzias of muhus. Or maybe not. Not sure what he means with that. You could say is the beginning of the mitzias of muhus of a rotzen, that will be a rotzen muchlet soon, when it's determined. Or you could say the heskim itself has stages. First, it's a movement of the spirit of the nefesh toward, from its own self-contained reality toward a possibility of a relationship. But he still says, or you could say, maybe this is the pshat, that this heskim is a cause that there should actually become a mitzias muhus of the heskim, which means a more defined consideration that will ultimately lead to the next stages. But let's continue reading. Again, this is not finished. So he says like this now.
Until now, we said that the Metzius Amos is not coming only after the Achlota. After the Shaklevetaya and the Achlota, then we're reaching Metzius Amahus.
Yeah, but the process begins with a heskim.
Begins, but it's not definite.
Okay, well, right now he's using the word mitzias mushala heskim. So I explained 2 points here. One is that is the beginning of the process for sure, because you can't get to a shakavataya, a deliberation and a determination if you don't have a consideration. So it's not. Remember, these are 3 steps in the Ratzon Kloli. Yes, until you don't have a determination, you can't call it yet. He said these words before. But you can't say there's nothing happening. Something's happening. But he says clearly, imkein moving, the heskim for it's on its own, ain't a dover adayin. These are clear. It's not a dover. It's not substance yet. The That's why it's called thought and not rotzen. Anyway, I would stop here. We're going to continue to read. I assure you one thing. This is my assurance. We're going to understand it by hook and by crook. We got to learn more lines, and we're getting there. Bottom line is, we've learned a lot more now about this heskim, this determination. We've also learned about Shaka V'Tarya, but we still have to understand what is the role of the deliberation in the level of desire when it can't contradict it or even weaken it. So leave that open, and we'll continue. Listen, this is, I don't want to compare it to Lahavdil, but if, like, when you watch a show, it always has to end with some suspense to keep you wanting more, right? So let's put it this like a little suspense, and we'll figure it out as we go. It's actually quite exciting. Okay, we'll stop here at the top of page 82. I'll be happy to take some questions.